Sorry babe, I guess you did not recognize me behind my giant Hello Kitty sunnies. I'm the Slug Glove. I made a dated, uninformed YouTube tutorial about coding Undertale. So yeah, maybe think twice next time you only give me one silly straw. And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I drew a tree or two, and in this part I work on the game's mobility, specifically coding how the dash mechanic now bounces off things. The first reason I wanted to make this was specifically because I already made an attack function, and now that I have a dash input as well as my attack function, the dash seemed a little bit overpowered compared to the attack function, this being the potion throwing, so I wanted to make the actual dash input have a different mobility setup than the attack function. I wanted them to work profoundly differently. So I decided to have it so that when dashing into an object or enemy, you do destroy these things, but instead now you bounce off these objects. This may sound unsatisfying and boring, but it's not, I promise. The actual motivation behind wanting to change the dash mechanic so it bounces off things is actually by how the slam mechanic has always worked. If you dash straight down, your character will slam into an object, but if you hit something, you will bounce off it. I found this mechanic and usage very, very satisfying and fun to perform. It's really quite satisfying to slam into an object and bounce off it. So now the dash mechanics do the exact same thing. You will now bounce off an object and play a funny little animation as you bounce off the object. Furthermore, you can then have another dash function after you slam into an object. I think this adds a whole lot more variety to player mobility because you can now dash into objects and use this to gain extra dash inputs or dash height. You could double jump, dash into an object, and then this resets your ability to double jump and dash again, so you can jump again and dash again, and it has more complexity to the already probably way too complex movement setup we currently have for the game. Okay, so how does this work? It is incredibly easy. If the object is to the right of us, we bounce left. If the object is to the left of us, we bounce right. The character will also always be trying to bounce upwards. This is because bouncing upwards is more satisfying and fun, but also for further design reasons that I will get to. We're always going to be bouncing in the opposite direction on the horizontal axis, but in the vertical axis, we're going to try to continuously be bouncing upwards. If the object was heavily above the player, we're simply just going to limit the amounts the player can bounce up. If you did a dash upwards and hit something above the player, which is unsatisfying and not very fun to do, so I'm generally going to limit the amount of times the player can do this in level designs to begin with. But the player could do such a thing, and did do such a thing. They're still going to be bouncing upwards after this dash, but it's just going to be limited to a very small degree. The way I find these values is just the opposite of the player's dash movement. Since this is only triggering when the player has collided with something when dashing, I can very easily check where the thing they dashed into was. Furthermore, when the player is dashing, the thing that they collided with is found with a collision check that is in scripting, so I already know through that scripting what the player is going to be dashing towards. Therefore, it can be reasonably deduced what the player has dashed into, where it is, the direction it was, and then the opposite direction we have to bounce off it. After this, all I have to do is set the player's velocity, force, gravity amounts, etc., based on the opposite values of whatever they hit, or whatever the Y amount is if it is above the player or below the player, depending on those values. One interesting thing I like about this system is when dashing into an object, there's actually a very slow delay after you have dashed into an object before you will be forced off the object. This is for two reasons. The first reason is to give the player a sense of impact. If they are immediately being pushed off an object after dashing into it, then it may not be as nice feeling for the player. They may feel like they have less control over their character inputs, and they may feel like there wasn't really much of an impact when they collided with a thing. So in this sense, I have the player collide with a thing and then stick on the object for only 0.05 seconds, which is a very small amount, but just gives the player a sense of impact that they have made with the object before bouncing off. It also means I can play one animation of the player blending into an impact state with this object before blending into the players being pushed away from the object. After this delay has occurred, all we do is transfer into the player's regular movement. We push away in the direction we have registered in the previous setup of code, and we push the player either up or down based on the direction of the object they hit, but almost assuredly upwards. And that's the entirety of the movement system. Hit objects, go backwards. As mentioned before, the main funny factor of this system is that after dashing into an object, you can dash into another object. This is mainly used for aerial dashing. So before, how the dashing would work is when in midair you can use a dash input once per midair function, and then you can't use a dash input again. This new system means you can now chain dash inputs. So if there was a giant wall of things you could dash into one diagonally to the right, then bounce off it and dash again diagonally to the left, gaining height. This means, and say it with me here, this gives more options for player movement and more choices the player can make when navigating levels and areas in how they want to navigate a scene. And as we all know, the key to good game design is just giving the player a bunch of options and choices and hoping they pick one that they enjoy. Ah, I love player options. Oh, so much. Realistically, I think the dash chaining mechanic that I have now added is pretty satisfying and fun to do. It's pretty easy to pull off and it's very easy to gain height with, but I guess that's only an issue if the player has a giant stack of objects that are breakable next to them. Otherwise they're only going to have one or two breakable objects that they can really combo for extended height and extended dashing. But I do think this adds more complexity to the game's design and the game's movement. It's also fun to do. It also plays a funny animation. Speaking of funny animations, let's talk about the animation setup for the dash impact recoil system, whatever I call this. Wow, was this system just an excuse to reuse that one smear frame I drew months ago and then removed from the game's system? Wow, it was. 100%. I really like the dash recoil animations. A lot of them are just the player hitting a thing and then readying into it. So this could just be either crouching down into it if the thing that they have hit is below the character, or recoiling to the right and grabbing onto it, or grabbing above it if it's above the player. Essentially just three different animations that are blended into very quickly for the player recoiling and then being pushed away very quickly and blending into a looping animation of the character recoiling. This is just the character rotating with the funny smear frame very quickly, but now they have their arms and legs sticking out of the smear frame. For some reason, I love this smear frame so much. I like how it looks. I just wanted to have this smear frame used. Of course, the animation isn't particularly complex. It's just the player rotating either clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on player velocity. But, and here's the key element here, the smear frame looks nice. The smear frame is the funny picture overlaying on the character's face. Wowzers, that sure is a silly image. Ah, I love it so much. For air falling, this is if the player has been falling in air for a long amount of time. All I do is just stretch this amount to give the impression of the player falling a further degree. If for some reason the player recoiled but there is a roof above the player, meaning they cannot recoil upwards, I will just have a recoil on the ground system. This is just the player being pushed down, squinting a bit, and then getting up. This is an incredibly niche animation that will most likely never be seen in game. This is only if the player has dashed into an object and there is a roof above the player and also ground above and also ground below the player. So it'll basically never happen, but if it does happen, this animation plays. And that's it for this devlog. I understand that this is maybe the most niche video I have made yet. Is anybody going to care about how this system was coded? Probably not, because nobody ever would want this code, the same system for their game. It is simply too niche. Who's going to Google this one? Absolutely nobody. But I had a fun time making this system, and I think it really adds to the game's gameplay as a whole. I think it makes the dash mechanic a lot more complex. It differentiates it from the attack mechanic. It looks nice. It is fun to perform. The player looks silly when performing this animation, attack, inputs. And it adds more complexity to player movements. All the things that I have said in this video. In the next part, I think I'm working on ropes, poles, and rings. It's a real doozy, that one, so you must subscribe to catch up with the latest Slug Club antics on that video.